To understand how Millicent Hearst arrived at that moment, poised, composed, performing the role of wife inside a house that had been redesigned around the woman replacing her, you have to go back further than scandal. You have to go back before the mistress, before the castle, before the newspapers reached every breakfast table in America. You have to go back to mining money, to a family that was not yet a dynasty, and to the particular kind of fortune that is built not on inheritance, but on extraction. Pulled from the earth, refined by ambition, and then handed to a single son who believed that owning things was indistinguishable from deserving them. The Hearst fortune began underground. George Hearst, William's father, was a Missouri born prospector who made his wealth in the blunt, speculative economy of Western mining. He held stakes in the Homestake Mine in South Dakota, the Offer in Nevada, the Anaconda in Montana, names that meant nothing to drawing rooms but meant everything to ledgers. He was not a man of culture. He was a man of appetite, of instinct, of the frontier conviction that what the earth contained belonged to whoever had the nerve to dig it out. He served as a United States Senator, acquired ranch land across California and into Mexico, and when he died in 1891, he left behind an estate valued at roughly $18 to $90 million. In the currency of the Gilded Age, that was not simply rich, that was foundational. It was the kind of money that could, if directed with care, build a name that outlasted the man who earned it. George's widow directed it with extraordinary care. Phoebe Apperson Hearst was 20 years younger than her husband, a schoolteacher from Missouri who had married him at 19 and spent the decades of his wealth building, turning raw money into cultural authority. She was small, composed, and relentless in her ambition, not for herself in any vulgar sense, but for the meaning of the family name. She traveled Europe with her son. She collected art and antiquities. She endowed buildings at the University of California. She funded kindergartens, libraries, archaeological expeditions. Contemporary accounts valued her own estate at between $5 and $10 million at the time of her death in 1919, but her real legacy was not financial. It was atmospheric. She had established, through decades of strategic generosity and social positioning, the principle that would govern the Hearst dynasty for generations. Men made the money, women made it mean something. That principle matters because it is the architecture Millicent would later inherit, and the architecture she would be forced to reinvent when the system that produced it betrayed her. George and Phoebe had one child. William Randolph Hearst was born on April 29, 1863, in San Francisco, and from the beginning his life was shaped by the collision between frontier appetite and civilizing ambition that defined his parents' marriage. His mother showed him Europe at the age of 10. Cathedrals, galleries, antiquities, the accumulated weight of old world culture pressed against a boy who had grown up surrounded by mining camps and Western expanse. His father gave him something different: scale, the conviction that if something existed, it could be acquired, and if it could be acquired, it should be. William absorbed both lessons with the completeness of an only child whose parents had no one else to shape. He would spend the rest of his life trying to possess culture and spectacle simultaneously, refinement and dominance in the same breath, and the tension between those two impulses would eventually fracture everything he touched. He was expelled from Harvard in 1885 for a prank involving chamber pots personalized with his professors' names, a detail that tells you nearly everything about his temperament. 2 years later, at 23, he talked his father into giving him the San Francisco Examiner, a failing newspaper George had acquired as a political instrument. William turned it profitable within 2 years through a formula of sensation, illustration, crusading headlines, and a willingness to spend money to make stories rather than merely report them. By 1895, he had bought the New York Morning Journal and begun the campaign of circulation-driven, politically aggressive journalism that would define his public identity for the next half-century. By the turn of the century, he owned papers in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and beyond. By 1902, he was in Congress. By 1906, he was running for governor of New York and losing. But the loss did not slow him. Nothing slowed him. He simply bought more. At his peak, and by his own organization's accounting, nearly 1 in 4 Americans received the news from a Hearst publication. 28 newspapers, 13 magazines, a wire service, radio stations, a film studio, and a real estate portfolio that stretched from Manhattan to a million-acre ranch in Mexico. This was not wealth in the conventional sense. This was narrative power, the ability to decide what the country saw, what it feared, what it celebrated, and what it chose to ignore. William Randolph Hearst did not stand beside American public life. He built the stage on which much of it was performed. But the stage was always more expensive than the receipts could cover. That is the other inheritance, the one the public image of omnipotence carefully obscured. Churchill, visiting San Simeon in the autumn of 1929, noted in his private letters not only the grandeur of the estate, but the harassed figure of a finance man, perpetually scrambling to find money to cover the next wave of purchases and building projects. William collected art the way other men collected stamps, compulsively, without limit, and often without immediate means of payment. He bought a castle in Wales. He imported monastery ceilings from Spain. He filled warehouses with tapestries and sculptures and crated antiquities that sat unpacked for years because there was no room left to display them. By 1938, Time reported that he was liquidating at least two-thirds of an art collection, valued at $15 million, a disposal driven by the need to settle debts and reduce the inheritance tax burden that would one day fall on his sons. The man who could commission a private zoo on a California hilltop could not, at critical points in his life, comfortably meet his own obligations. The dynasty's operating principle was magnificence. Its operating condition was strain, and the distance between the two would in time become one of the forces that tore the family apart. The properties tell the story in physical terms. George Hearst had purchased the San Simeon ranch land in 1865, nearly 100,000 acres of California coastal range. William also held Wintune, a 67,000-acre estate in the forests of Northern California, built around a Bavarian-style village that Julia Morgan designed for him. There was St. Donat's Castle in Wales, a medieval fortress he purchased in 1925 and filled with European art and armor. There was a million-acre ranch at Babicora in northern Mexico. There were commercial properties in Santa Monica and New York, apartments and beach houses and offices and warehouses, stacked with crated treasures he had not yet found a wall to hang them on. In any other family, these would be assets. In the Hearst story, they are emotional geography, rival stages on which legitimacy and desire and control would be performed and contested. San Simeon would become the Western Dream Palace, the court of Marion Davies. New York would become Millicent's seat of title and civic authority. The other properties would orbit between those two poles, sometimes useful, sometimes merely expensive. Always a reminder that this was a family that owned more world than it could coherently inhabit. That is the machine Millicent Willson walked into. And to understand why she survived it, why she outlasted the humiliation, the exile, and the decades of managed indignity that followed, you have to understand what she was before the name swallowed her. She was not society. She was not wealth. She was not even, by the standards of the world she was about to enter, considered respectable. Millicent Veronica Willson was born on July 16, 1882, in New York City. Her father, George Willson, was a vaudeville performer of moderate success, a man who made his living on the commercial stage, not in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue or the counting houses of Wall Street. Her mother was Hannah Murray Willson. There was no fortune behind the name, no lineage to activate, no social position waiting to be claimed. There was talent, work, and a particular kind of self-invention that the American theater demanded of its families in the final years of the 19th century. Millicent and her sister Anita performed on stage as teenagers. They were dancers, chorus girls, what the era called bicycle girls, young women whose beauty and physical grace were deployed as part of the visual machinery of Broadway revue. It was honest work, and it was public work, and it placed Millicent squarely in a category that polite New York regarded with a mixture of fascination and condescension. The commercial stage was where respectable men went to look at women they would never introduce to their mothers. That at least was the assumption. William Randolph Hearst first saw her in 1896. He was 33 years old, already wealthy, already a major newspaper publisher. She was 16. The age gap alone tells you something essential about the power dynamics at play, but the class gap tells you more. He was the son of a senator and a philanthropist, expelled from Harvard, but educated at St. Paul's before that, raised inside the assumption that the world existed to be arranged according to his preferences. She was the daughter of a vaudevillian, earning her living in the chorus line of a New York show. In the social arithmetic of the Gilded Age, this was not a courtship between equals. It was acquisition dressed as romance. And the 7-year courtship that followed, from 1896 to 1903, suggested the negotiation was at least as complex as the feeling. The principal obstacle was Phoebe. George Hearst's widow, the woman who had spent 3 decades converting mining money into cultural respectability, looked at Millicent Willson and saw the undoing of her life's work. A chorus girl, a performer's daughter, a young woman with no family name, no education of the sort Phoebe valued, no position that would consolidate the upward trajectory she had spent decades engineering. Phoebe's resistance was not personal cruelty, it was structural logic. She had built a system in which Hearst women dignified Hearst money, and this girl, however charming, did not fit the design. William married her anyway. April 28th, 1903, in New York. He was 40, she was 20, perhaps 21. Sources differ by a few months on the precise arithmetic, but the gap was constant, and the meaning of that gap was legible to everyone present. Whatever Phoebe felt, she had one consolation remaining. Time tends to settle what argument cannot. And time, in this case, delivered exactly what was needed. The children came quickly. George Randolph Hearst, the eldest, was born in 1904. William Randolph Hearst Jr. followed in 1908. John Randolph Hearst arrived after that. Then, in 1915, the twins, Randolph Apperson Hearst and David Whitmire Hearst, 5 sons in 11 years. A dynasty needs heirs, and Millicent had provided them with the efficiency of a woman who understood, perhaps instinctively, that her position inside this family would rest not on charm or romantic hold, but on biological fact. Phoebe's resistance dissolved inside the arrival of grandchildren. The chorus girl had done the one thing that no amount of social pedigree could replicate. She had produced the next generation. There is something about that detail worth sitting with. From the moment those boys existed, Millicent's value to the Hearst structure became non-negotiable. She was not merely a wife, she was the mother of continuity. She had given the empire its future. And that fact, and that her security was rooted not in love but in succession, would prove to be the most consequential reality of her entire life. It was the reason she could never be fully discarded, even after she was no longer desired, and it was the reason the marriage endured in law for nearly 50 years after it had ceased to exist in feeling. It was the reason the woman who began as a chorus girl would end as the official custodian of one of the most powerful names in American life. The sons were the architecture, everything else. The title, the public dignity, the invitations, the committees, the charitable platforms rested on their existence. Each of those sons would grow up inside the contradiction their parents' marriage had become, and each would absorb it differently. George, the eldest, born in 1904, would become a vice president of the Hearst Corporation. Dutiful, proximate to the business, carrying the burden of the firstborn. He was the son closest to the company's operations, and therefore closest to the fracture between what the family presented and what it actually was. He died in 1972, having spent most of his adult life inside the organization his father built and his mother was exiled from. William Jr., born in 1908, would become the most publicly visible of the brothers, editor-in-chief of Hearst newspapers after his father's death, a Pulitzer Prize winner for his reporting on Khrushchev, and the son who would later describe his parents' separation with the kind of precision that only comes from having grown up inside it. There had been no formal parting, he said, no announcement, no legal proceeding, no single moment anyone could point to and say, that is when the marriage ended. John, the third son, would become the least publicly legible of the 5, a Hearst executive who died in 1958 at 49. His relative absence from the public record is itself a kind of testimony. Not every cost in these families announces itself theatrically. Some damage registers only as silence. The twins occupied a different position, Born last, arriving in 1915 when the family was already large and the empire already vast, Randolph Apperson Hearst would live the longest of the five brothers, dying in 2000, and would become the bridge between the old Hearst world and its late 20th century afterlife, not least because he was the father of Patricia Hearst, whose kidnapping in 1974 would drag the family name back into national crisis in a form no one could have anticipated. Forbes would later estimate Randolph's personal wealth at $1.8 billion. David Whitmire Hearst, Randolph's twin, became a Hearst Corporation vice president and died in 1986. He was quieter, less publicly defined, a reminder that dynastic continuity often looks bureaucratic from the outside while remaining emotionally loaded underneath. All five boys would in time side with their mother emotionally while depending on their father for their careers. That split, gut feeling indexed to Millicent, livelihood indexed to William, was the inheritance that had nothing to do with money. It was the pattern they absorbed before they were old enough to name it, and it would govern how each of them navigated the decades of divided loyalty that followed. They were, in the deepest sense, children of a divided sovereignty. They had a mother they loved and a father they needed, and the two could not be reconciled inside a single household because the household itself had been severed into separate kingdoms. The etiquette they learned was not the etiquette of dinner tables or business meetings. It was the etiquette of silence. The knowledge, acquired in childhood and never fully shed, that certain arrangements are understood by everyone and spoken about by no one. But before the split, before the parallel households and the managed silence and the vast geographical estrangement, there were years that were real, not performed, not strategic, real. William and Millicent's early marriage operated inside the expanding machinery of his ambition, and that machinery, for all its eventual destructiveness, produced genuine shared experience. They lived in New York in a style dictated by his income and his temperament, which meant lavishly, restlessly, with political entertaining, newspaper business spilling across every dinner table, and the constant motion of a man who treated the city as both his marketplace and his stage. The Hearst household in those years was not quiet. It was a hub of influence. Editors, politicians, society figures, foreign correspondents, men and women who understood that access to William Randolph Hearst was access to the machinery of American public opinion. Millicent presided over that world with a competence that surprised people who remembered her origins. She had come from the commercial theater, from dressing rooms and chorus calls, and now she was hosting governors and senators. The transition was not seamless. Phoebe's early skepticism had not been without basis, but Millicent made it work through observation, discipline, and the particular kind of social intelligence that the stage teaches better than any finishing school. She studied the world she had married into, and she learned its codes faster than that world expected. The family also spent time together at the San Simeon ranch before the castle existed, camping on Camp Hill, riding the land that George Hearst had first purchased in 1865, nearly 100,000 acres of California ranch land stretching from the Santa Lucia Mountains to the Pacific. The boys grew up moving between New York and California, between the political intensity of their father's eastern operations and the open physical expanse of the western land. Millicent was present for the earliest conversations about what to build on that hilltop, and when construction began in earnest after Phoebe's death in 1919, she contributed design suggestions that William relayed to his architect, Julia Morgan. She was not decorative in those years. She was participatory. She helped shape the earliest vision of the very stage from which she would later be excluded, and that irony should be understood clearly, because it is one of the cruelest details in the entire story. Morgan herself carries a thread worth noting. She was one of the first women to be licensed as an architect in California, and William enlisted her in 1919 to turn his boyhood hilltop into something permanent. Their collaboration would run for 28 years. Morgan would design Casa Grande, the 3 guest houses, the Neptune pool, the Roman pool, the gardens and terraces, and carefully engineered approaches to the hilltop. She would translate William's appetite for European antiquity, for scale, for visual dominance, into physical form. She was the professional witness to the family's transformation. The woman building a monument to one man's desire, while the wife who had helped conceive it was gradually disappearing from its rooms. The family's public standing rose with the empire's expansion. William's newspaper multiplied. His political ambitions, though serially disappointed at the ballot box, generated a web of connections and obligations that made the Hearst household a center of national political gravity. His art collecting intensified, not in the careful manner of a connoisseur, but in the consuming manner of a man for whom acquisition was a form of self expression. Crates arrived, warehouses filled, catalogs circulated. Millicent's own visibility grew alongside the empire, not merely as a wife at society dinners, but as a civic figure in her own right, a woman who was beginning to understand that public usefulness could be converted into a form of authority that did not depend on a husband's affection. The historical world around them was shifting, and Millicent moved with it. The Gilded Age had given way to the Progressive Era, and then to the urgent patriotism of the First World War. Millicent found her platform in wartime service. She chaired the Mayor's Committee of Women on National Defense under Mayor John Hylan in New York. She raised funds for France, for French orphans, for wartime relief organizations. She was photographed, quoted, recognized, not as Mrs. Hearst, the society wife, but as Mrs. Hearst, the public servant. In 1921, with the war behind her, she established the Free Milk Fund for Babies, a charitable organization that would become her most enduring public cause and eventually her most durable shield. During the Depression, she would work alongside Eleanor Roosevelt at charitable events in New York, distributing milk and coal and relief to families who could not feed their children. That collaboration is worth noting now because it tells you something about the altitude of Millicent's civic life. She was operating in the orbit of the First Lady, not in the shadow of her husband's mistress. The Free Milk Fund was not vanity charity. It was structure, the kind of institutional work that survives personal crisis because it has its own momentum, its own board, its own public meaning, independent of whoever founded it. She was learning something in those years that would prove more valuable than any social introduction or any husband's reflected prestige. She was learning to convert a name into authority, to perform usefulness so consistently and so publicly that the world would continue to take her seriously regardless of what happened inside her marriage. That education was happening just in time, because by the late 19 teens, William Randolph Hearst had already begun constructing another world, one that had no room for Millicent in it. Marion Cecilia Duras was born in Brooklyn on January 3rd, 1897. Like Millicent, she came from a family without social standing. Like Millicent, she was performing on stage as a young woman, luminous, charming, conspicuously talented. And like Millicent, she was seen by William Randolph Hearst while she stood in front of an audience. The repetition's not incidental, it is the pattern. Hearst found the same thing twice, 15 years apart, in the same world, the world of Broadway performance, of young women whose presence drew the eye of powerful older men. The difference was not in the women. The difference was in what Hearst chose to build around his desire the second time. He saw Marion in the Ziegfeld Follies around 1917. She was 20. He was 54. The age gap was almost identical to the one that had separated him from Millicent 2 decades earlier, and the setting was the same. A theater, a stage, a young woman whose beauty and talent made her visible to a man who had the resources to reshape her life entirely. By 1918, he was financing her film career through Cosmopolitan Productions, the studio he had created to produce motion pictures, initially based in New York and using the facilities at his Harlem studio. Marion appeared in costume dramas and period pieces, many of them lavish, many of them promoted aggressively through Hearst's own newspapers. The promotion was relentless, and in the industry's judgment, often counterproductive. It drew attention to the relationship as much as to the performances. But Hearst could not help himself. He wanted Marion to be a star, and he owned the machinery that manufactured stardom. By the early 1920s, the operation had moved west to California, and Marion with it. She was not a passing infatuation. She was a project, a companion, a household, and eventually the emotional and social center of San Simeon itself. She was, by every account, a gifted comedian, lighter on her feet in comic roles than in the heavy period dramas Hearst preferred for her. and a genuinely warm human being. People who knew her described a woman of quick wit, personal generosity, and a kind of unfussy charm that put even intimidated guests at ease. She was also an investor shrewd enough to avoid the debt that consumed Hearst himself, and loyal enough to hand him $1 million of her own money in the late 30s, when his empire teetered on the edge of collapse. She was not the caricature that Citizen Kane would later impose on public memory, the talentless mistress propped up by a controlling man. She was something more complicated, more sympathetic, and more difficult for any simple telling of this story to absorb. But what Marion was, above all, was permanent. And as Julia Morgan continued to build, as the Hilltop complex grew into the most famous private residence in America, with its towers and pools and imported ceilings and guest houses named after celestial bodies, Marion was becoming the presiding feminine presence of that world. She was the one who greeted the guests. She was the one who organized the evenings. She was the one who sat beside Hearst at the long dining table, while Hollywood actors, politicians, visiting dignitaries, and European writers passed through for weekends that felt like appearances at a private court. The guest lists alone tell you the scale of the thing. Charlie Chaplin, Greta Garbo, Winston Churchill, Calvin Coolidge, Charles Lindbergh, George Bernard Shaw. People who came because Hearst was powerful, and who stayed because Marion made it pleasurable. Millicent, 3,000 miles away in New York, was watching the arrangement harden into something that could no longer be described as an affair. It was becoming an institution, a second household with its own rules, its own guest list, its own architecture of intimacy and obligation. And if the Hearst dynasty operated on the principle that women made the family's meaning legible to the outside world, then there were now two women performing that function, one in New York, one in California. And this system that had always depended on a single center of feminine authority was developing a crack that could not be plastered over with money or silence. The family's best years were already ending. The boys were growing. The empire was expanding. The castle was rising on the hilltop. And inside the marriage that was supposed to hold all of it together, the ground had already shifted beneath the surface. Quietly, invisibly, in the manner of a structure that looks solid from the outside, while the foundation have already begun to move. What came next would not arrive as a single catastrophe. It would arrive as a slow, irreversible rearrangement of the family's geography, loyalty, and meaning. And it would test whether the woman who had entered this dynasty as a chorus girl from a vaudeville family could outlast the enchantment that was being built stone by imported stone to replace her. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. There is a period in every dynasty story when the machinery is working, when the money is flowing, the name is rising, the children are young, and the cracks, though they may already exist, have not yet widened enough to let the light through. For the Hearsts, that period ran from just after the marriage in 1903 through the early 1920s. And if the outline of those years looks like triumph, it is because from the outside, that is exactly what it was. William Randolph Hearst was building at a pace that defied ordinary comprehension. By the end of the First World War, his newspaper chain stretched across the country. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, Baltimore, Seattle, and beyond. His magazines, including Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, and Harper's Bazaar, reached millions of American households. His wire service, the International News Service, supplied copy to papers that did not carry his masthead but carried his sensibility. His newsreels played in cinemas. His political endorsements could make or wound a candidacy. He was not merely rich. He was infrastructural. The country's information environment ran, in part, on the machinery he owned. Millicent's world expanded in parallel. In New York, she was the wife of the most powerful publisher in America, and that position came with obligations she fulfilled with increasing confidence. She hosted political dinners. She appeared at charity galas. She sat on committees. She moved through a social world that included not only the newspaper elite, but the broader orbit of Tammany-era New York politics, Catholic philanthropy, and the particular stratum of society that existed between old money and new influence, a world where the Hearst name opened every door, but was never quite regarded as old enough to have built them. Millicent navigated that ambiguity with the instinct of a woman who had spent her earliest years watching audiences from the stage. She understood performance, she understood timing, and she understood that in the world she now inhabited, credibility was a thing you constructed by showing up, consistently, usefully, in the right rooms with the right expression of purpose. The five boys were the visible architecture of all of it. George, the eldest, was already absorbing the family's patterns by the time he reached adolescence. The scale of his father's operations, the expectation that Hearst's sons would enter the business, the unspoken awareness that their mother's position was more complicated than the public photographs suggested. William Jr., 4 years younger, was developing the journalistic instincts that would later earn him a Pulitzer. But he was also developing the quiet perceptiveness of a second son, the one who watches more than the firstborn, who notices the things that are not said at dinner, who registers the shifting weather of a household without being old enough to name it. John III was the most inward of the brothers, the one whose presence in the record is thinnest and whose interior life is therefore the hardest to reconstruct. The twins, Randolph and David, born in 1915, were still young enough during the family's best years to experience them as children experience anything. As the given world, the only normal they knew, unaware that what felt permanent was already in motion beneath them. The family photograph from those years, and there were many because William owned the cameras and the printing presses, shows a large, handsome, prosperous American family. 5 boys in graduated height, a mother with the carriage of a woman who has learned to hold herself inside public scrutiny, a father whose physical bulk and wide face radiated the particular confidence of a man who has never been told no often enough to learn what the word means. The image is Edwardian in its formality, American in its optimism, and misleading in its suggestion of unity. Because even during the best years, there were hairline fractures running through the foundation. They just had not yet reached the surface. The world the family inhabited during those peak years was immense in every direction. There were the New York apartments and the political receptions. There was San Simeon, still under construction, but already functioning as a family retreat. The boys riding horses, the Pacific visible from the hilltop. Julia Morgan's workmen cutting stone and pouring concrete in what felt like a permanent act of creation. There was Wintune, the Northern California forest estate with its fairy tale Bavarian cottages along the McCloud River. There was the ranch at Babicora in Mexico, vast and remote, a remnant of George Hearst's extractive ambitions, now maintained as a cattle operation. There was St. Donat's Castle in Wales, purchased in 1925, a medieval fortress that William filled with armor, tapestries, and the accumulated weight of European history. The family did not merely own property, they owned landscape, enough of it to constitute a private geography, with its own logic of movement and season and purpose. Millicent moved through that geography as the official Mrs. Hearst. She brought the boys, she presided over tables, she participated in the choreography of arrival and departure and hosting that the empire's social life demanded. She was not marginal in those years, she was central, and yet the center was already shifting. That is the cruelest feature of this period. It is not that the good years were false, it is that they were real and insufficient at the same time. William needed more than a family, more than an empire, more than 28 newspapers and 13 magazines and a castle on a hill. He needed to feel that the world was still yielding to him, still producing new enchantments, still offering the kind of emotional novelty that made possession feel like discovery. That need was the engine of everything he built. It was also the engine of everything he destroyed. William's appetite for women did not begin with Marion Davies and was unlikely to have been perfectly disciplined during the years before her. He was a man of immense means, immense ego, and immense access to the theatrical world, from which he had drawn both his wife and eventually her successor. His newspaper gave him proximity to performers, actresses, singers, and socialites. His wealth gave him the means to pursue whatever caught his attention. His position gave him the privacy to do so without consequence, because the men who might have reported on his private life were in many cases men who worked for him. That insulation is part of the story. The Hearst press, which could savage a politician's reputation over breakfast, maintained a studied silence about its proprietor's personal arrangements. The machinery of exposure was also, when required, a machinery of concealment, but Marion was different. Marion was not a dalliance that could be absorbed and forgotten. She was a project that grew until it became a world. By the early 1920s, the contours of that world were becoming visible. Hearst had established Cosmopolitan Productions as a filmmaking enterprise, initially based in New York, and Marion was its principal star. He promoted her films through his newspapers, with an enthusiasm that the film industry regarded as excessive, and the public found difficult to separate from the relationship behind it. When the operation moved to California, first to a bungalow on the MGM lot, then to the broader social world of Hollywood, Marion moved with it, and the nature of the arrangement shifted from something that could be discussed in euphemisms to something that required its own infrastructure. She had a house, she had a social calendar, she had a public presence that was intertwined with Hearst's in a way that no amount of editorial discretion could fully obscure. For Millicent, watching this unfold must have carried a particular cruelty that went beyond ordinary jealousy. This was not a secret affair. This was her husband building a visible, public institutional life around another woman, using the same resources, the newspapers, the money, the social machinery that had built the life he shared with her. He was not hiding Marion. He was promoting her. He was using the tools of his empire to construct her career, her reputation, her public identity, and in doing so, he was broadcasting to anyone who could read the fact that his emotional investment had moved elsewhere. The Hearst press, which mentioned Millicent only in the context of charity events and civic functions, mentioned Marion in the context of glamour, film, beauty, and romance. The contrast was editorial, and it was unmistakable. San Simeon crystallized the arrangement into architecture. As Julia Morgan's construction advanced through the 20s, Casa Grande rising on the hilltop, the guest houses taking shape around it, the gardens and terraces and pools expanding year by year, the estate became not merely a private residence, but a social institution. Hearst invited the world to his hilltop. Hollywood stars, studio executives, politicians, foreign dignitaries, writers, and aristocrats made the long drive up the coast from Los Angeles, past the ranch's exotic animals grazing on the hillsides, to arrive at a complex that felt like a private principality. The weekends were choreographed: drinks before dinner, formal seating, a single long table, filmed screened in the private cinema after the meal, guests assigned to specific cottages, and at the center of it all, two presences: Hearst at the head of the table and Marion beside him, organizing, charming, diffusing the formality with a warmth and irreverence that guests consistently remembered as the thing that made San Simeon bearable rather than merely impressive. Millicent was still, technically, welcome. She visited the castle in the years immediately following the estrangement, sometimes with family, sometimes with friends. But the gravitational center of the place had shifted, and everyone present understood the shift, even if no one named it aloud. The official hostess was no longer the official wife. The woman who poured the drinks and set the tone and made the guests feel wanted was Marion, not Millicent. And in a house built to perform one man's vision of totality, art, architecture, nature, society, all fused into a single hilltop spectacle, there was no neutral ground. Every room expressed ownership. Every dinner expressed hierarchy. To be present at San Simeon as the legal wife, while the emotional partner presided, was an experience whose cruelty lay not in any overt act of exclusion, but in the steady architectural fact of displacement. The house itself had been built around someone else. The estrangement came in 1926. That is the date given by Hearst Castle's own institutional history, and it is described with a single devastating word: intolerable. The increasingly open liaison with Marion Davies had become intolerable. Not surprising, not new. Intolerable. The word implies not a sudden discovery, but a threshold. The point at which an accumulation of indignity exceeded what endurance could absorb. Millicent had known about Marion for years. She had watched the films promoted, the houses established, the California weekends proliferate. She had seen the guest lists. She had read the newspapers, her husband's newspapers, in which Marion's name appeared with a frequency that told its own story. What changed in 1926 was not the information. What changed was the conclusion Millicent drew from it. She did not file for divorce. She did not stage a public confrontation. She did not sell her story to a rival newspaper, though any editor in the country would have paid for it. What she did was quieter and in its way more devastating. She established a separate residence in New York. She drew a geographical line. She remained Mrs. William Randolph Hearst in law, in public address, in social standing, and in every directory and committee listing that mattered. But she ceased to function as his domestic partner. The marriage became a title maintained by mutual agreement for reasons that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with structure. That decision to separate without divorcing was not weakness, it was strategy. A divorce in 1926 would have produced a settlement, but it would also have produced a scandal of national proportions. It would have given every rival publisher, every political enemy, every gossip columnist in New York the ammunition to redefine the Hearst name around its most private humiliation. The sons, ranging in age from 11 to 22, would have been forced into public positions of loyalty. The business empire, which depended in part on the family's image of stability and patriarchal command, would have absorbed a blow from which the stock of public confidence might not have recovered, and Millicent herself would have lost the one asset that no settlement could replace: the name. As long as she was Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, she was the dynasty's official representative in New York. As a divorcee, she would have been a former wife, sympathized with perhaps, but no longer sovereign. She chose sovereignty, and in choosing it, she forced the entire Hearst system into a permanent accommodation. William could live with Marion. He could host the world at San Simeon. He could build his California kingdom of film and fantasy and imported antiquity, but he could not erase Millicent from the official record. He could not remarry. He could not present Marion as anything other than what the world already understood her to be. The legal wife held the East, the companion held the West, and the empire, which had always depended on the fiction that one man could command everything, now had to operate across a divided map. The practical reality of that division was both banal and extraordinary. There was no formal announcement, there were no court proceedings. There was no settlement, no decree, no public statement from either party. The marriage simply reorganized itself around absence. William no longer came home to Millicent. Millicent no longer traveled west to William. The Hearst Corporation continued to function, and both households continued to draw on its resources. But the emotional and domestic logic of the family had been permanently altered. Holidays were negotiated, visits were arranged, the sons moved between residences like diplomats, shuttling between capitals, carrying affection in one direction and obligation in the other. The family's public image, already curated through Hearst's control of his own press, was managed so that the separation never became a headline. It simply became a fact, understood by insiders and unspoken in print. The silence was not accidental. It was the product of a media empire that had always understood, better than any other institution in the country, that what is not published does not, for practical purposes, exist. The sons absorbed the division in the way that children of these arrangements always do, unevenly, silently, and with a loyalty that split along lines no one had drawn for them. By several accounts, all five sided with their mother emotionally. They understood what had been done to her. They understood the humiliation of the arrangement. They understood that their father's choice had not merely wounded their mother, but had restructured the family into something that required constant, careful navigation. And yet their livelihoods were indexed to their father. George, the eldest, was by the late 20s already inside the Hearst business, learning the operations, absorbing the culture of an organization that treated its founder's word as a law. He was 22 when the estrangement formalized, old enough to understand its full dimensions, old enough to feel the impossibility of the position it placed him in. He could not denounce his father without imperiling his career. He could not abandon his mother without betraying the woman who had raised him. He did what eldest sons of fractured dynasties often do. He stayed, he worked, he said little, and he carried the weight of proximity to both sides. William Jr., 18 in 1926, was developing his own voice as a journalist, a voice that would eventually carry him to a Pulitzer Prize and to the editorial command of the entire Hearst newspaper chain. But before all of that, he was a young man watching his family split in two and learning the lesson that every child of scandal learns, that some truths are acknowledged by everyone and spoken about by no one. John, the quietest of the brothers, was navigating his own path into adulthood with less public visibility and one suspects no less private difficulty. The twins, Randolph and Devin, were 11 years old in 1926. They were children. They did not choose sides because children do not choose sides. They simply live inside the world their parents create and absorb its logic as if it were the weather. What all five shared, regardless of age or temperament, was the experience of operating across the family's two kingdoms. They visited their mother in New York. They visited their father in California. They moved between the discipline of Millicent's civic world and the grandeur of their father's court, between the woman who fed babies and the man who fed Hollywood, between the quiet dignity of the East Coast and the extravagant theater of the West. That oscillation was not merely geographical, it was moral, and it taught them, early and permanently, that the family they belonged to was not one thing but two, and that their own identities would be constructed across the gap between them. The world outside the family saw the arrangement with varying degrees of clarity. In New York, Millicent's circle understood and respected her position. She was not pitied, she was admired, in the particular way that women of her era admired other women who absorbed injury without visible collapse. Her philanthropic work intensified after the separation. The Free Milk Fund grew. Her committee work expanded. She sat on boards. She chaired galas. She became, in the language of New York civic life, indispensable. A woman whose name on a letterhead meant that the cause was serious, the money was real, and the social commitment was genuine. She appeared at events alongside figures of public stature, Eleanor Roosevelt among them, and in doing so she demonstrated, without ever needing to say it aloud, that her relevance was not dependent on proximity to her husband. She had built her own platform, and it held. The New York she inhabited after 1926 was in its way a counter-court. If San Simeon was the kingdom of spectacle, Hollywood guests imported art, a hilltop designed to overwhelm, then Millicent's New York was the kingdom of respectability. Her world was committees and fundraisers, Catholic charities and civic boards, the sober architecture of a city that valued usefulness over enchantment. She moved through it as Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, and that name, far from being a source of embarrassment, became the instrument of her authority. People addressed her with the deference owed to a title. She accepted that deference without comment. She had converted the worst thing that had happened to her into the structural foundation of everything that followed. And if there was a cost, loneliness, bitterness, the private acknowledgement that dignity is not the same as happiness, she did not allow it to become visible. In California, the arrangement was equally legible but differently interpreted. Marion Davies was not regarded as a homewrecker by the Hollywood world that orbited San Simeon. She was regarded as a hostess, a companion, a woman whose relationship with Hearst was understood by everyone present and judged by almost no one, at least not to her face. The film colony operated on its own moral code, and that code did not penalize mistresses who were generous, charming, and attached to men of sufficient power. Marion hosted costume parties, beach gatherings at the Santa Monica house Hearst had built for her, and the legendary San Simeon weekends where the guest lists read like a casting call for American power. Her position was, in its way, as stable as Millicent's. She had the man, the house, the social world, and the emotional reality of daily companionship. What she did not have was the title, and in a dynasty built on the premise that names mean something, that absence was not trivial. Nobody around Hearst was capable of interrupting the arrangement, and that institutional failure is part of the story. His editors worked for him, his lawyers served him, his financial advisors could plead and warn, but they could not compel. The social world around him was too dazzled, too dependent, or too intimidated to say the thing that needed saying. That a man who maintained two parallel households, who spent beyond his means to sustain both, and who expected his sons to navigate the wreckage without complaint was not exercising freedom, but inflicting a particular kind of structural violence on every person bound to him by blood, contract, or affection. The system that should have checked him, business advisors, social convention, moral scrutiny, had been neutralized by the scale of his wealth and the reach of his press. He lived uncorrected. And uncorrected men in these stories eventually reach the point where the cost of their freedom is distributed to everyone around them. The most revealing witness to the arrangement appeared in September 1929 when Winston Churchill visited San Simeon during an American tour. Churchill was not yet prime minister. He was between offices, traveling with his son Randolph, and had been invited to the hilltop in the manner that all prominent visitors were invited, as a guest of honor whose presence would add luster to the court that Hearst and Marion had constructed. He made the long drive up the coast. He saw the exotic animals grazing on the hillsides as the road climbed: zebras, deer, Barbary sheep, the remnants of what had once been a private zoo of startling ambition. He arrived at the white hilltop complex, with its towers and terraces and the Neptune pool gleaming in the California light. He was assigned a guest house. He was shown the art. He was seated at the long refectory table beneath medieval banners and imported European ceilings, and he observed. What Churchill saw was a man living inside a fantasy so complete and so expensive that it had consumed all the oxygen around it. The art was magnificent and the scale was absurd. The finance man, perpetually in attendance, was perpetually anxious, scrambling to cover the latest purchases, the latest building project, the latest shipment of crated antiquities from a London dealer. And the domestic arrangement was as legible as a stage play. Millicent was present during at least part of the visit. Marion was present throughout. The two women occupied the same physical space with a choreography that had been refined by years of practice. And Churchill, who had spent a lifetime inside the British aristocratic world, where similar arrangements were managed with greater discretion and less architectural extravagance, understood exactly what he was seeing. The letter he wrote to Clementine afterward captured the situation with a precision that no insider account could match, precisely because it came from the outside. He described Hearst as a man of immense income, perpetually overspent, surrounded by magnificence and attended by anxiety. He noted the arrangement with what amounted to dry amusement. Hearst appeared to have two charming wives and a complete indifference to public opinion about the fact. For Churchill, this was observation, not judgment. He had seen worse in English country houses. But for the purposes of this story, his letter is invaluable because it confirms from an independent, formidable witness what the family had spent years trying to obscure. The arrangement was not private. It was not managed. It was simply so large and so well funded that the people inside it could pretend that visibility did not matter. That letter matters not merely as historical evidence, but as emotional confirmation. For Millicent, the Churchill visit, and whether or not she was aware of what he later wrote to Clementine, represented something she had understood for years. The arrangement was now part of how the world understood the Hearst name. It was not gossip, it was not rumor. It was the acknowledged structure of the family, discussed in private letters by visiting statesmen, visible to every guest who climbed the hilltop, and managed not through secrecy, but through the sheer scale of the money and power that surrounded it. Nobody confronted Hearst because nobody could afford to. And nobody pitied Millicent publicly because she had made clear through her bearing and her civic work that pity was not what she required. The 1930s brought a different kind of pressure. The Depression hit the Hearst empire with a force that no amount of editorial belligerence could deflect. Advertising revenue collapsed. Newspapers that had been profitable in the boom years became liabilities. The art collection, always more extensive than any responsible financial advisor would have tolerated, now sat in warehouses and galleries as a monument to overextension. The building at San Simeon continued intermittently, but the mood had shifted from creation to survival. The world that had tolerated Hearst's appetites when his income seemed inexhaustible began to recalculate when the income faltered. Creditors pressed, advisors intervened. The empire that had once looked like a force of nature began to look like what it had always been: a personal indulgence sustained by cash flow and dangerously exposed when that flow slowed. For Millicent, the Depression had a paradoxical effect. It strengthened her position. Her philanthropic work, the Free Milk Fund, the committee service, the visible public usefulness became more valuable, not less, in an era when millions of Americans could not feed their children. She was photographed distributing milk. She was named on relief committees. She stood beside Eleanor Roosevelt at charity events that carried genuine social weight. The wife who had been sidelined by scandal was now, in the public eye, the Hearst who was doing something useful. William was building castles and buying art. Millicent was feeding babies. The moral optics were not subtle, and Millicent, who had spent 2 decades learning how public perception worked, understood them perfectly. It was against this backdrop that, according to widely repeated secondary accounts, Millicent explored the possibility of divorce in 1937. The negotiations reportedly collapsed when her financial demands, mainly said to involve ownership of Cosmopolitan magazine or its equivalent value, exceeded what Hearst was willing or able to concede. The precise terms are not as firmly documented as the core chronology of the marriage, and the episode should be understood with that caveat. But the underlying truth it reveals is sound, regardless of the specifics. By the late 30s, the marriage remained legally intact because dissolution would have cost more than maintenance. Millicent kept the name because the name was worth more to her than any settlement. Hearst kept the structure because a divorce would have invited precisely the kind of public scrutiny his press empire existed to prevent. Marion kept the man because the man, whatever his failings, had organized his emotional and domestic life around her with a completeness that could not be undone without rupturing the business itself. The arrangement held. It held through the 20s, the 30s, the Depression, the New Deal, the war. It held because everyone involved had calculated correctly that the cost of breaking it would exceed the cost of enduring it. But holding is not the same as thriving. And by the late 30s, the strain was no longer merely emotional, it was financial. The family that had been built on the premise that appetite could be sustained indefinitely was about to discover what happened when the money began to answer back. The money answered back in 1937. It had been whispering for years. In the nervous calculations of Hearst's financial advisors, in the tightening credit lines, in the growing gap between what the empire earned and what its founders spent. But in 1937, the whisper became a shout. The Hearst Corporation was overextended. Advertising revenue, which had cratered during the worst of the Depression and never fully recovered, could no longer sustain the combination of newspapers, magazines, radio stations, film operations, real estate, art collecting, and the continuous construction of a castle on a California hilltop. The organization that had once seemed inexhaustible was now visibly struggling, and the struggle was not abstract. It had consequences that reached into every corner of the family's life. The timing was significant. The Depression had struck American business broadly, but it struck empires built on advertising and consumer spending with particular force. Newspapers depended on advertising. Magazines depended on advertising. Film studios depended on audiences with disposable income. Radio stations depended on sponsors with marketing budgets. Every revenue stream in the Hearst portfolio ran through the same vulnerable channel. And when that channel narrowed, the entire structure trembled. Other media companies absorbed the shock by cutting costs, selling assets, and accepting reduced ambitions. Hearst had never accepted reduced ambitions in his life. The collision between his temperament and the arithmetic of the Depression was therefore not merely financial, it was existential. William Randolph Hearst had spent decades behaving as though income and expenditure existed in separate universes, as though the sheer scale of his earning power made questions of budget irrelevant. He had bought art on credit. He had imported architectural elements from European churches and monasteries without waiting for the funds to clear. He had maintained multiple estates across 2 continents, each with its own staff, its own maintenance costs, its own appetite for capital. And he had done all of it while also running a media empire whose operating costs were themselves enormous and whose profitability depended on advertising markets he could influence but not control. The result was a structure of magnificent instability. Everything looked solid from the outside. Inside, the load-bearing walls were cracking. The corporate reorganization that followed was humiliating in a way that mattered to the story's emotional architecture because it attacked the one thing William Randolph Hearst had never been willing to surrender: control. A conservation committee was established to restructure the empire's finances, and its recommendations were not suggestions. Newspapers were sold or consolidated. Radio stations were disposed of. Real estate was liquidated. Properties that had once served as the physical markers of the Hearst dynasty's reach, estates, apartments, commercial holdings, they were put on the market or surrendered to creditors. St. C. Donet's Castle in Wales, which Hearst had purchased in 1925 and filled with art and armor, and the trappings of European aristocratic fantasy, would eventually be sold. The Babicora Ranch in Mexico, a million-acre remnant of George Hearst's frontier ambitions, was disposed of. The geography of the empire was contracting, and every property lost was a piece of the map that had once made the family feel limitless. The art collection, which Hearst had assembled over 4 decades with the compulsiveness of a man who believed that beauty could be stockpiled against mortality, became the most visible casualty of the restructuring. By 1938, Time reported that Hearst was disposing of at least two-thirds of an art collection, valued at $15 million. The scale of that figure is difficult to absorb without understanding what it represented in physical terms. Warehouses full of crated paintings, sculptures, tapestries, suits of armor, medieval furniture, architectural fragments, antiquities from Egypt and Greece and Rome, silver, ceramics, entire rooms dismantled from European palaces and shipped across the Atlantic in pieces. Much of it had never been displayed. Some of it had never been uncrated. It sat in storage, the material evidence of an appetite that had outrun any conceivable use. And now it was being sold, not because Hearst wanted to part with it, but because the financial structure that had enabled the collecting could no longer sustain the weight. The disposition was tied, Time noted, to the need to settle debts and reduce the inheritance tax burden that would eventually fall on his heirs. The heirs, of course, were Millicent's sons. The liquidation mood of those years should be understood not merely as a financial event, but as a psychological one. For a man whose identity was built on acquisition, who had defined himself through the act of possessing newspapers, properties, art, women, political influence, and public attention, the forced surrender of his collection was a kind of death. The objects were not merely objects to him. They were proof of taste, of reach, of the civilizing ambition his mother Phoebe had instilled in him. To watch them crated and catalogued and sold was to watch the physical evidence of his life's meaning being broken apart and dispersed. It was not ruin in the melodramatic sense. It was diminishment. And diminishment for William Randolph Hearst was a fate worse than poverty. It was in this context that Marion Davies did something that complicated every easy version of her story. She gave Hearst a check for $1 million. The precise circumstances are recounted in her official profile and repeated in multiple secondary accounts. When the empire was at its most precarious, when the advisors were circling and the creditors were pressing and the art was being sold, Marion reached into her own resources and handed the man she loved a sum of money that represented not merely generosity but a reversal of the relationship's founding dynamic. He had made her career. He had built her houses. He had promoted her films and funded her lifestyle and constructed the world she inhabited, and now she was the one writing the check. The kept woman was keeping the keeper. That detail matters enormously in a script about Millicent, because it disrupts the moral simplicity the audience might be tempted to impose. Marion was not merely the cause of scandal. She was materially loyal in a way that went beyond what most people in any relationship are ever called upon to demonstrate. Millicent was not merely the injured wife. She was the guardian of a respectability that the family needed in order to survive the financial crisis with its public standing intact. And Hearst himself was not merely a villain or a fool. He was a patriarch whose system had grown too large to sustain itself without the devotion of both women, one providing emotional companionship and material rescue, the other providing legitimacy and continuity. The triangle, at this point in the story, was not a romance. It was a load-bearing structure. Remove any one element and the whole thing collapsed. Millicent's position during the financial crisis was, paradoxically, strengthened by the very disaster that threatened the empire. Her New York philanthropic work had made her indispensable to a world that valued public usefulness above private glamour. While William was selling art and consolidating newspapers, Millicent was distributing milk to hungry children and sitting on the relief committees with the First Lady. The contrast was not lost on the public, and it was not lost on the social world that surrounded both of them. William's California court was shrinking under financial pressure. Millicent's New York counter kingdom was expanding under moral authority. The wife who had been exiled from the hilltop was now, in the currency that mattered during the Depression, visible compassion, civic responsibility, institutional seriousness, the more powerful of the two women. The sons were navigating their own passage through the crisis, and their paths were beginning to diverge in ways that reflected both their individual temperaments and their shared inheritance of divided loyalty. George, the eldest, was by the late 30s deep inside the Hearst Corporation, a vice president, a company man, the son who had accepted the bargain most fully. He worked for the organization his father had built, and in doing so, he accepted the implicit condition of that employment: silence about the arrangement, cooperation with the corporate structure, and the suppression of whatever private feelings he carried about his mother's exile and his father's choices. George's trajectory was the cleanest illustration of the son's collective dilemma. To be a Hearst heir was to work for the man who had humiliated the woman who raised you, and to do so without public complaint, because the alternative, independence from the corporation, would have meant independence from the fortune, and none of the brothers chose that path. William Jr. was developing differently. He had entered journalism not merely as an heir occupying a desk, but as a reporter with genuine instincts, and his career would eventually take him to Moscow, where his interviews with Soviet leaders would earn him a Pulitzer Prize. But even William Jr., the most publicly accomplished of the brothers in his own right, remained inside the Hearst system. His Pulitzer was won while working for a Hearst newspaper. His editorial authority, when it came, was exercised within the Hearst chain. He had talent that might have flourished anywhere, but the gravitational pull of the family name was too strong, and the economic logic of the inheritance too compelling to permit genuine departure. He stayed. They all stayed. John, the third son, remained the most opaque. His career inside the Hearst Corporation was real but unremarkable in the public record, and his early death in 1958, at 49, would cut his story shorter than his brother's. Whether that opacity reflects a man who preferred privacy, a man whose contributions were organizational rather than editorial, or a man whose interior damage from the family's fracture expressed itself in withdrawal rather than achievement, the available record does not say with confidence. What it does say is that John occupied the middle position, not the firstborn's burden, not the youngest distance, and that middle children in dysfunctional families often absorb more than they express. The twins, Randolph and David, were in their 20s during the worst of the financial crisis. They were young men forming their adult identities inside a family whose public image was omnipotence and whose private reality was strain. Both would enter the Hearst Corporation. Both would become executives. Both would marry, have children, and extend the dynasty into the next generation. But their formative experience was not the empire at its peak. It was the empire under siege, art being sold, newspapers being consolidated, their father's control being wrestled away by financial committees, their mother maintaining a separate court in New York, and the whole structure holding together through a combination of institutional momentum and collective refusal to acknowledge what had broken. The late 30s gave way to the 40s, and the 40s brought a different kind of attrition. The Second World War reshaped American life in ways that touched even the insulated world of the Hearst dynasty. William's newspapers, which had spent much of the 30s publishing editorial positions sympathetic to isolationism and hostile to Roosevelt's internationalism, were now compelled to pivot toward the patriotic consensus that the war demanded. The editorial voice of the Hearst press, once the most combative in the country, became one among many supporting the war effort. William's political influence, which had been declining since the financial crisis, diminished further. He was no longer the man who could make or break a candidacy with a headline. He was an aging publisher whose opinions were increasingly regarded as relics of an earlier era. Marion retired from films. Her last picture had been released in 1937, and by the early 40s she had ceased to be a working actress in any meaningful sense. The retirement was not forced in the crude sense, but it was inevitable. The Cosmopolitan Productions operation had been shut down. The promotional machinery of the Hearst Press, which had once pushed her films into every paper in the chain, had been redirected towards survival rather than star making. And Marion herself was approaching her mid 40s, an age at which Hollywood, then as now, offered diminishing roles to women and limitless patience for men. She settled into the role that would define the rest of her life with Hearst, not actress, not star, but companion, the woman who stayed. She had always been more than the screen career Hearst had tried to build for her, and in a way, the end of that career liberated her from the distorting lens of his promotion. She was freer now to be what she had always been in private: warm, funny, shrewd, and devoted to a man who needed her more with each passing year. And then, in 1941, the family's private arrangements were translated into the most famous film in American cinema. Citizen Kane, directed by and starring Orson Welles, told the story of a media tycoon whose life of accumulation ends in loneliness and the whispered mystery of a word, Rosebud. The parallels to Hearst were unmistakable and were understood as intentional. The tycoon's vast estate, his failed political ambitions, his newspapers, his obsessive promotion of an untalented second wife. The film took the architecture of Hearst's life and refashioned it into a parable of American excess and loss. Hearst, who understood the power of narrative better than almost anyone alive, understood immediately what Welles had done. He banned any mention of the film from his newspapers. He attempted, through intermediaries, to prevent its distribution. The Hearst Press waged a campaign against Welles that was widely recognized as retaliatory. The damage the film inflicted was not evenly distributed. It landed hardest on Marion. Welles's version of the second wife, Susan Alexander Kane, an untalented singer whose career is manufactured by the tycoon's money and whose misery is compounded by his controlling ambition, was a distortion of Marion's actual gifts and actual character. Marion was not Susan Alexander. She was a talented comedian who had been miscast by Hearst's promotion into prestige roles that did not suit her, and who had been far more capable and independent than Welles's portrait allowed. But the film's version proved more durable than the truth. For decades after Citizen Kane, the public image of the woman at Hearst's side was shaped not by Marion's actual life, but by Welles's fictionalized reduction of it. That injustice is part of the story, and it adds another layer to Millicent's strange victory. The cultural record that survived was cruel not to the wife, but to the mistress. For Millicent, Citizen Kane was something else entirely. She barely appeared in the film's imagination. The legal wife was a peripheral figure in Welles's telling, a woman who existed only to be abandoned, not to be understood. That erasure, which might have stung another person, was in some ways the final proof of Millicent's strategy. She had made herself so thoroughly the woman of public duty, of civic usefulness, of institutional respectability, that the dramatists and mythmakers who came to tell the Hearst story could not find a narrative hook to hang on her. She was too disciplined to be interesting in the way that Hollywood understood interesting. She had no breakdown, no scandal of her own, no public collapse. She had dignity, and dignity in the economy of storytelling is almost invisible. The film that would define how the world remembered the Hearst name had no room for the woman who had spent 4 decades holding that name together. For Millicent, the war years reinforced the pattern she had established in the Depression. Public service was her medium, and the war gave her new outlets for it. She was in her 60s now, a woman whose face and name were familiar to New York's civic world, whose presence on a committee roster signaled seriousness, and whose title, Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, still carried a weight that had nothing to do with her husband's current affections and everything to do with the structures she had spent decades maintaining. She had outlasted the scandal. She had outlasted the financial crisis. She was outlasting the war, and she was doing it not through dramatics or public recrimination, but through the quiet, relentless accumulation of public usefulness. The same strategy she had pursued since the 1920s, refined over 2 decades until it was indistinguishable from who she was. The sons, meanwhile, were becoming men whose adult lives bore the permanent imprint of their family's divided architecture. George, William Jr., John, Randolph, and David were all by the mid-40s established inside the Hearst Corporation in various capacities. They had married, they were having children of their own. The dynasty was extending into a 3rd generation, And with that extension came the question that all dynasties eventually face. What exactly is being passed down? The money was being passed down, though diminished by the financial crisis and the restructuring. The name was being passed down, though tarnished by the public knowledge of the arrangement. The business was being passed down, though transformed from a personal empire into a more conventional corporation, managed by committees and boards rather than by a single patriarch's whim. But the emotional inheritance, the divided loyalty, the etiquette of silence, the knowledge that the family's public image was a carefully maintained fiction, that too was being passed down, absorbed by the grandchildren as naturally as it had been absorbed by the sons. The pattern did not require explanation. It required only proximity. Hearst, too, was changing. He was in his late 70s by the mid 40s, and the physical vitality that had fueled his decades of acquisition was fading. He was still formidable in his opinions, still capable of sending editorial directives that shaped the content of his remaining newspapers, still insistent on the rituals of his private court. But the court itself was contracting. San Simeon, which had hosted the world during the 20s and 30s, was quieter now. The guest lists were shorter. The building projects had slowed. The zoo animals, once a defining feature of the approach up the hill, had been given away or dispersed. The imported treasures that remained were witnesses to a former grandeur, not evidence of a continuing one. The estate that had been designed as a monument to one man's appetite was becoming a monument to his decline, and the decline, though slow, was unmistakable. There is a particular kind of diminishment that affects men who have lived at the scale William Randolph Hearst lived at. It is not merely physical, though the physical component is real enough. It is ontological. A man whose identity has been built on expansion, more papers, more properties, more art, more women, more influence, more power, more everything, discovers in old age that the process has reversed. The empire is smaller, the reach is shorter, the rooms are emptier. The people who once came because they wanted something now come because they feel obligated. The shift from acquisition to maintenance, from building to holding on, is devastating for a man like Hearst because it attacks not just his comfort but his sense of meaning. He had always defined himself by what he was adding to the world. Now the world was taking things away. The gathering quiet of those years is worth dwelling on because it was not peace. It was the sound of a system running out of the energy that had sustained its contradictions. Marion and Hearst were together, but together inside a world that had shrunk from a hilltop kingdom to a domestic arrangement in which the grandeur had been replaced by medical attention and diminishing company. Millicent was in New York, sovereign but alone, maintaining a public life built on the absence that her husband's choices had imposed. She attended her galas. She chaired her committees. She saw her sons and their families. But the injury that had organized her adult life had not healed. It had merely hardened into the load-bearing structure of her identity. The sons were scattered across the corporation, competent and loyal and constrained by the same bargain their parents had struck in 1926. The name holds, the arrangement endures. Nobody speaks about the thing that everyone knows. Nobody in the family was happy in the way that happy families are happy. Nobody was free in the way that people outside dynasties are free. The arrangement that had been designed to allow William Randolph Hearst to have everything had produced over 3 decades a family in which nobody had enough. In 1947, the arrangement met its physical limit. Hearst's health had deteriorated across the preceding years, his heart weakening, his stamina diminishing, the robust frame that had once commanded every room now requiring the kind of constant medical attention that the remoteness of San Simeon made impractical. The castle sat on a hilltop accessible only by a long, winding road through the ranch. The nearest major hospital was hours away. The altitude, the isolation, the sheer logistical difficulty of moving medical equipment and personnel to a hilltop in the Santa Lucia Mountains. All of it conspired against the man who had chosen this site, precisely because its remoteness made it feel like a private kingdom. The thing he had loved about San Simeon, its separation from the ordinary world, was now the thing that threatened to kill him. The doctors were clear. The advisors concurred. And so, in a departure that carried the emotional weight of an abdication, even as it was presented as a practical medical decision, William Randolph Hearst left San Simeon for the last time. He was 84 years old. He had spent nearly 3 decades building and inhabiting the Hilltop complex, from the first conversations with Julia Morgan in 1919 to this final departure in 1947. The castle had been his vision, made physical. Every tower, every pool, every imported ceiling, every crated antiquity placed according to his wishes. It was the most elaborate expression of private will in American architectural history, and he was leaving it because his body could no longer sustain the dream his mind had built. He did not go alone. Marion went with him. They moved to a house on Beverly Drive in Beverly Hills, a house that was comfortable and well appointed and medically convenient and utterly lacking in the theatrical grandeur that had defined their life together for a quarter of a century. There were no towers. There were no guest houses named after celestial bodies. There was no Neptune pool. There was no long refectory table where the world's most famous faces had gathered to eat under medieval banners. There was a wealthy old man and the woman who had loved him since she was 20, living in a neighborhood of wealthy old people, attended by doctors and nurses and the remnants of a household staff that had once managed an estate the size of a small principality. The Hilltop Kingdom was over. The imported ceilings, the Roman pool with its mosaic tiles, the guest houses where Chaplin and Garbo and Churchill had slept, the terraces where Marion had hosted parties that felt like the social center of American cultural life, all of it was left behind, maintained by a skeleton staff, visited by almost no one, waiting for a future that none of its inhabitants had planned for. The dream palace that had humiliated Millicent, that had embodied William's appetite and Marion's ascendancy, that had served for decades as the physical expression of everything the Hearst name meant, at its most extravagant and its most cruel. That place was now essentially abandoned, and its abandonment was, in its way, as eloquent as its construction had been. The man who had built a monument to desire had outlived his ability to inhabit it. Millicent in New York did not visit. She had not needed the castle for decades, and she did not need the Beverly Hills house now. She had built her own architecture, civic, philanthropic, maternal, structural, and it did not require California hilltops or imported marble or zebras on the approach road. Her kingdom was committees and charities and the 5 sons who still called her mother and still bore the name she had refused to surrender. She was 65 years old. She had been Mrs. William Randolph Hearst for 44 years. She had been effectively separated for 21 of them. And she was still standing. There was something about that endurance worth sitting with. Millicent had entered the Hearst dynasty as a performer's daughter, a chorus girl from the wrong world, a young woman whose claim to the name was secured not by pedigree but by motherhood. She had watched her husband fall in love with another woman and build that woman a castle. She had watched her own role diminish from wife to title holder, from partner to official fiction. She had watched a Hollywood film reduce the Hearst story to a parable in which she barely existed. She had watched the empire nearly collapse under the weight of her husband's appetites. And through all of it, from the humiliation, the geographical exile, the financial crisis, the cultural erasure, she had refused to leave the stage. She had not divorced. She had not retreated into anonymity. She had not surrendered the name. She had done the opposite. She had turned the name into her instrument, using it to build a public identity so thoroughly grounded in civic usefulness that it could not be dismissed as mere social pretension. The woman who had once been a bicycle girl on Broadway was now one of the most visible philanthropic figures in New York. That transformation was not accidental. It was the work of a lifetime. The question that now hung over the family was not whether the marriage had survived. It had not, in any sense that mattered, emotionally. The question was, what would happen when the patriarch who had maintained 2 kingdoms, 2 households, 2 women, and the fiction that all of it could coexist, was no longer alive to hold the arrangement together? The empire needed a single story. The will would need a single legal logic. The corporate succession would need a single chain of authority. And the 2 women who had shared the Hearst name, one in law, one in feeling, were about to discover which version of the legacy the family would choose to preserve. The sons knew what was coming. They had spent their adult lives inside the contradiction, working for their father while loving their mother, absorbing the divided geography as if it were natural, learning to speak in the careful, measured tones of people who understand that certain arrangements are not to be named aloud. They had careers, families, positions in the corporation. They had obligations to the trust structure that held the Hearst fortune. And they had, somewhere beneath the professional composure, the accumulated weight of decades of managed silence. What Hearst's death would force into the open was not merely a question of inheritance. It was a question of which version of the family, Millicent's version, grounded in legitimacy and duty, or Marion's version, grounded in companionship and devotion, would be validated by the machinery of law and money. William Randolph Hearst was 84 years old. His heart was failing. The man who had spent a lifetime acquiring everything, newspapers, castles, art, women, political influence, and the power to shape what an entire nation believed, was about to lose the one thing that even he could not buy more of. And the family he had built around his own contradictions was approaching the moment that no amount of money, power, or editorial control could manage. The last 4 years of William Randolph Hearst's life were lived in a key entirely different from the decades that preceded them. The Beverly Hills house on Beverly Drive was spacious and well appointed, but it was not San Simeon. There were no towers. There were no imported ceilings from Spanish monasteries. There were no zebras wandering the hillside approach, no Neptune pool catching the California light, no guest houses where the world's most famous faces gathered for weekends choreographed to the last detail. There was a wealthy old man in declining health and the woman who had loved him for more than 30 years, living together in the particular quiet that descends on a household when the dominant personality in it can no longer dominate. The contrast with everything that had come before was stark and deliberate in its way. Hearst had spent the first 84 years of his life in constant expansion, acquiring, building, collecting, hiring, publishing, entertaining, constructing monuments to his own appetite that were visible from miles away. Now the world had compressed to a few rooms, a garden, a daily routine organized around medication and rest. The visitors who came were not heads of state or Hollywood stars. They were doctors, lawyers, family members, and the small circle of friends who remained loyal, not because Hearst could still do something for them, but because they cared about him personally. The court had dispersed. What remained was a household. Marion was his constant presence. She managed the household. She attended to his needs. She absorbed the daily reality of a man whose body was betraying the will that had once bent an entire country's media landscape to his preferences. Hearst's heart condition required medical supervision, and the house in Beverly Hills was organized around that requirement: nurses, doctors, medications, the careful monitoring of a man whose vitality had once seemed inexhaustible and was now measured in good days and bad days, in whether he could sit up, whether he could read the papers, whether his energy held through dinner or failed before dessert. Marion bore this with a steadiness that the public record consistently acknowledges. She was not merely staying out of obligation. She was staying out of love, and the distinction matters, because it is the thing that makes her story irreducible to the simple moral framework that the word mistress invites. Hearst, for his part, had not surrendered his sense of command. He continued to issue editorial directives to his newspapers. He continued to involve himself in the corporation's affairs, though his involvement was increasingly filtered through advisors and family members who managed the flow of information to protect both his health and the company's stability. He was still William Randolph Hearst. He still expected the world to arrange itself according to his wishes. But the world had narrowed to a house, a garden, a handful of visitors, and the woman who brought him his meals and sat with him through the evenings. The man who had once entertained heads of state on a private hilltop was now entertaining his doctor and his nurse. The sons visited. George, William Jr., John, Randolph, and David moved between their own lives, their careers inside the Hearst Corporation, their marriages, their children, the obligations of men in their 30s and 40s who were expected to be the next generation of a dynasty that was no longer expanding, but consolidating. And the Beverly Hills house, where their father was slowly dying. The visits were dutiful, affectionate, and loaded with the unspoken complexity that had defined the family's emotional life for a quarter of a century. They loved their father. They resented what he had done to their mother. They depended on the business he had built. They were loyal to the woman in New York who had raised them and to the woman in Beverly Hills who was caring for the man who had raised them. The contradictions did not resolve. They simply coexisted, as they had always coexisted, inside the careful silence the family had perfected. George, the eldest, was now in his mid-40s, a vice president of the corporation, a man whose entire professional life had been spent inside the system his father created. He understood the business better than any of his brothers, and he understood, with the clarity that proximity brings, how fragile the empire's financial structure still was, despite the post-war recovery. William Jr. was approaching the peak of his journalistic career. The Pulitzer Prize for his Khrushchev reporting would come later in the decade, but he was already established as the brother with the sharpest public profile and the strongest independent credentials within the Hearst chain. John, quieter, less legible in the public record, was managing his own corner of the corporation with the efficiency of a man who had learned early that in this family, visibility was not always an advantage. The twins, Randolph and David, now in their mid-30s, were the youngest voices in the corporate structure, close enough to their father to feel the weight of his decline, and old enough to understand that what was coming, the death, the estate, the succession, would reshape everything they had known. Each of them carried a version of the same question. What would the corporation look like when the man who had built it, who had run it as a personal instrument for nearly 60 years, was no longer there to impose his will? The question was not merely operational, it was existential. The Hearst Corporation had always been an extension of William Randolph Hearst's personality. His preferences shaped its editorial positions. His appetites shaped its spending. His relationships shaped its power structure. Remove the personality, and what remained was a media conglomerate that would need to function like any other, through boards, committees, institutional processes, and the professional management of competing interests. The sons would need to be those managers, and they would need to manage not only the business, but the family's story. Millicent, 3,000 miles away, occupied a position that was by now so thoroughly established that it required no active maintenance. She was Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. She was the mother of his 5 sons. She was the philanthropist, the committee chair, the civic figure whose name appeared on letterheads and donor lists across New York. She was 70 years old, and the architecture of her public life, the free milk fund, the charities, the social engagements, the steady performance of respectability, had been in place for so long that it had ceased to feel like strategy and had become simply who she was. Whether she followed the reports of her husband's declining health with sorrow, with relief, with the complicated mixture of both that estranged spouses often feel, the available record does not say. What it says is that she did not go to Beverly Hills. She did not attempt a reconciliation. She did not insert herself into the vigil that Marion was maintaining. She held her position. She had been holding it for 25 years. She would hold it until the end. The corporate situation, meanwhile, was developing in ways that would produce the most explosive consequence of Hearst's death. In 1950, with his health visibly failing, Hearst signed a voting trust agreement that would govern the future control of the Hearst Corporation. The details of this arrangement, as reported by Time in the aftermath of his death, were startling. The agreement designated Marion Davies as the sole voting trustee of the corporation, a provision that, if enforced, would have placed the woman who had been Hearst's companion for 3 decades in a position of formal authority over the business that bore his name, the business that employed his sons, the business that represented the entirety of the Hearst family's financial future. Whether that arrangement reflected Hearst's genuine wish to reward Marion's decades of loyalty, or whether it was the product of a dying man's diminished judgment, or whether it was a negotiating position intended to be modified before it took effect, remains a matter of interpretation. What is not in dispute is the alarm it produced. The sons and the estate's legal advisors understood immediately what the voting trust implied. If Marion controlled the corporation's votes, she controlled the corporation. The woman who had been kept outside the family's official structure for 30 years, who had never been a wife, never been a mother to the heirs, never been recognized in law as anything other than a companion, would become, in practical terms, the most powerful figure in the Hearst empire. The legal wife's sons would answer to the mistress. That prospect was intolerable to the family in the same way that Marion's ascendancy had been intolerable to Millicent in 1926, not because of personal animosity, though personal animosity may have played its part, but because of structural impossibility. The Hearst Corporation was not merely a business. It was the family's identity, the family's income, the family's legacy, and the family's claim to continuity. To hand its control to a woman who existed outside the family's legal and biological architecture was to repudiate in a single legal instrument everything that Millicent's decades of endurance had been designed to protect: the name, the line, the sons. The official version of what the Hearst dynasty was and who belonged to it. The gathering storm of those final months was therefore not merely medical, it was legal, corporate, and dynastic. Like behind the quiet of the Beverly Hills household, behind the tender routine of Marion's caregiving and the doctor's visits and the slow diminishment of a man who had once controlled the largest media empire in America, a battle was forming over who would inherit not just the money but the meaning. The sons were not going to allow the voting trust to stand unchallenged. The estate's administrators were preparing their positions, and Marion, who had spent 30 years as the woman William loved but the family would not formally acknowledge, was about to discover whether love was enough to secure a place in the structure that love had never been permitted to enter. The irony of the voting trust was that it represented in legal form the contradiction Hearst had lived inside for decades. He wanted Marion protected. He wanted his sons to prosper. He wanted the corporation to endure. He wanted the family name to mean what it had always meant. And he wanted all of these things simultaneously, without acknowledging that some of them were mutually exclusive. The voting trust gave Marion power. The family structure gave the sons legitimacy. The corporation needed coherent leadership, and the name belonged, by a half-century of public practice and legal record, to Millicent. No legal instrument could make all of those claims compatible, but Hearst, who had spent a lifetime treating incompatibility as a problem that money could solve, appears to have believed, though hoped, that the structure would hold after his death as it had held during his life. It would not. It could not. The arrangement had always depended on his presence at the center, and the center was about to be removed. Hearst himself, in those last months, appears to have been aware of the tensions, but unable or unwilling to resolve them. He had spent a lifetime maintaining incompatible commitments to Millicent and to Marion, to his sons and to his companion, to the public image of patriarchal authority and the private reality of divided desire. He had never chosen. Choosing would have required surrendering one world for the other, and surrender was not in his vocabulary. Even now, with his heart failing and the end approaching, the contradiction persisted. The voting trust was his last act of refusal, a refusal to let go of Marion, a refusal to let the family absorb her into its official narrative, a refusal to die inside a single, coherent version of his own life. He wanted both. He had always wanted both, and the wanting, which had driven every acquisition and every betrayal and every spectacular act of construction and destruction across 9 decades of living, would outlast him. August 14th, 1951, a Tuesday, Beverly Hills. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when the household has been organized around illness for months and the illness has finally reached its conclusion. William Randolph Hearst died that morning. He was 88 years old. Marion was present. The doctors were present. The staff was present. The specific details of the final hours are not extensively documented in the public record, but what is known is that the death was not sudden. It was the end of a long deterioration. A heart that had been weakening for years finally stopping, a body that had been declining for years finally giving way, a man who had spent 90 years in motion, coming at last to rest. There was no dramatic last utterance. There was no rosebud. The real ending of a real life does not organize itself around a screenwriter's symbolism. There was an old man dying in a comfortable house in Beverly Hills with the woman he had loved for 34 years beside him, and a legal wife 3,000 miles away in New York who had not shared his daily life in a quarter of a century, but who remained, in every legal and official sense, his widow. The body would be taken from the house and prepared for burial. The family would be notified. The press would be informed. The machinery of a public death, The obituaries, the statements, the arrangements would begin to move with the practiced efficiency of an organization that had spent decades managing public narratives. But in the room where Hearst died, before any of that machinery engaged, there was a moment that belonged only to the people present. Marion had spent the last 4 years nursing this man. She had watched him diminish from the patriarch, who had built an empire, to the patient who needed help getting out of a chair. She had absorbed the daily indignities of his decline with a devotion that even the family's most hostile members never seriously questioned. And now he was gone. The man around whom she had organized her entire adult life was gone. Whatever happened next, the legal battles, the corporate succession, the family's assertion of control at this moment in this room was hers. The news moved quickly. The Hearst press, which had spent decades managing the public narrative of its founder's life, now had to manage the narrative of his death. The obituaries were respectful and extensive, befitting a man who had shaped American journalism, politics, and culture for half a century. They described his empire, his ambitions, his political campaigns, his castle at San Simeon, his vast art collection, his failures and his achievements. They mentioned Millicent as his wife and surviving widow. They mentioned Marion, if at all, with the careful ellipsis that the era's social conventions demanded, like a friend, a companion, a figure acknowledged but not explained. The gap between the public version of the death and the private version was already, within hours, becoming apparent. The public version was dignified and complete. The private version was fracturing along lines that had been set decades earlier. Marion's account of what happened next has been repeated in multiple secondary sources and carries the weight of a story that crystallized the family's dynamics into a single devastating sequence. She said, then the claim has been widely reported, though not independently verified in every detail, that she was not permitted to attend the funeral. That the family moved quickly, after Hearst's death, to assert control over the proceedings, the estate, and the narrative. That the sons and the legal advisors closed ranks around Millicent's version of the family, the legal version, the official version, the version in which Marion was not a partner, but an irregularity. And that Marion was, in the hours and days after the death of the man she had loved and cared for and financially supported, effectively excluded from the rituals of mourning that should have been hers by right of devotion, if not by right of law. Whether every detail of that account is precisely accurate, the emotional truth it contains is consistent with everything the story has established. The Hearst family's operating principle had always been that official structure trumped private feeling. Millicent had held the name. The sons had held the line. The corporation had held the authority. Marion had held the man. And now the man was gone. And the thing that Marion held, his love, his companionship, his daily presence, was the one thing that could not be inherited, could not be incorporated, could not be filed as an asset of the estate. What remained was the legal architecture, and the legal architecture belonged to Millicent. The funeral was held at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, the city where William Randolph Hearst had been born 88 years earlier and where the San Francisco Examiner, the newspaper that started everything, still published under the family name. Millicent attended as the widow. She was 69 years old, dressed in black, flanked by her sons, performing the role she had performed for half a century. The official Mrs. Hearst, the woman whose claim to the name was grounded in law and maternity and the refusal to be displaced. The sons attended as the heirs, 5 men in suits, the biological proof that the dynasty would continue, that the Hearst line ran through Millicent and not through the woman who had spent 34 years at their father's side. The service was public, formal, and attended by figures from the worlds of business, politics, and media that Hearst had spent a lifetime shaping. It was consistent with the image of a great American family mourning its patriarch. It was also, in its composition and in its absences, the final expression of the family's central principle, that official structure determined who belonged and who did not. Marion was not there, the woman who had sat beside Hearst at 10,000 dinners, who had hosted the world on his hilltop, who had given him $1 million when his empire was failing, who had nursed him through the last 4 years of his life with a devotion that no one disputed. That woman was absent from the ceremony that marked the end of his life. Her absence was not an oversight. It was a decision. And the decision was made by the family that Millicent had held together through a quarter century of managed separation. Whether Marion chose not to attend because she felt unwelcome, or whether she was explicitly discouraged from attending, the effect was the same. The funeral told the public a story about who the Hearst family was, and that story did not include her. The woman who had been the center of Hearst's emotional life for longer than some marriages last was rendered invisible at the moment when visibility mattered most. The estate itself was, as Time reported, a labyrinth. The true value of Hearst's holdings was impossible to determine immediately because of the complexity of the corporate structure, the interlocking ownership of newspapers, magazines, radio stations, and real estate, the debts and encumbrances that had accumulated over decades of overextension, and the legal instruments, including the voting trust, that Hearst had put in place in his final years. The corporate holdings alone comprised newspapers across the country, magazines with millions of readers, radio stations, real estate in multiple states, and the remnants of the art collection that had survived the 1930s liquidation. The personal holdings were entangled with the corporate ones in ways that would take lawyers years to untangle. San Simeon itself, the castle, the guest houses, the pools, the gardens, the ranch, the remaining art and furnishings, was not simply a piece of property. It was a monument, a museum, a working ranch, and a financial liability all at once. The estate was not a fortune in the clean sense. It was a maze of assets and obligations, and the people who had to navigate it, the sons, the lawyers, the corporate administrators, were doing so while also navigating the emotional wreckage of a family that had never resolved its central contradiction. Even the fortune, it turned out, died in a fog of entanglement. The voting trust arrangement became the immediate flashpoint. Randolph Apperson Hearst, the fourth son, was identified in Times reporting as one of the principal figures in the counterattack against Marion's potential corporate authority. The family's position was clear. Whatever William's wishes may have been, the corporation belonged to the family. The family was defined by blood and law, and Marion was outside both. The legal challenge to the trust was mounted quickly and with the full resources of the Hearst estate behind it. The fight, had it gone to court, would have been one of the most extraordinary legal battles in American corporate history. On one side, a woman who had been the constant companion of the founder for 34 years, who had contributed materially to the company's survival, and who held a legal document signed by the man whose name was on the building. On the other, the 5 sons of his legal marriage, backed by a corporate establishment that regarded the voting trust as an aberration, a dying man's sentimental gesture that threatened the institutional stability of a multi-million-dollar media empire. The case would have required the courts to adjudicate not merely the validity of a legal instrument, but the competing claims of love and law, of devotion and legitimacy, of the woman who stayed and the woman who endured. Marion did not fight. She surrendered the voting trust claim. The reasons for her decision are not fully documented in the public record, but the calculus is not difficult to imagine. A legal battle against the entire Hearst family, against 5 sons, an army of corporate lawyers, and the institutional momentum of one of America's largest media companies would have been expensive, exhausting, and almost certainly futile. Even if the trust was technically valid, the practical reality was that the family controlled the corporation's operations, its management, and its culture. Marion could have won a legal battle and still lost the war. She could have become, in the eyes of the press and the public, the woman who fought the grieving widow and the fatherless sons for control of a dead man's empire. The optics were impossible. The emotional cost was unbearable. She let it go. That surrender was the final act of the triangle. Marion had the love, Millicent had the name, and when the man who had tried to hold both expired, the name won. It won not because it was morally superior or because it represented a truer version of Hearst's life. It won because it was legal, because it was institutional, because it had sons and lawyers and a corporate structure behind it, and because the woman who had maintained it, Millicent Veronica Willson Hearst, had spent 25 years making sure that when the moment of reckoning came, the official version of the family would be the one that endured. Marion was 54 years old. She had given 34 years of her life to a man who could not marry her, would not choose her publicly over his legal family, and had left behind a legal instrument that his sons would use every resource at their disposal to void. She had been the emotional center of the most famous household in America. She had been the hostess of the most legendary private residence on the continent. She had given the man she loved $1 million when his empire was failing. She had nursed him through his final years with a devotion that no one, not even his sons, disputed. And now he was dead, and the family had closed ranks, and she was standing outside the gates of the legacy she had helped sustain. Within 11 weeks of Hearst's death, Marion would marry Horace Brown, a sea captain. The speed of that remarriage has been interpreted variously, as loneliness, as defiance, as the act of a woman who understood that without Hearst, she had no structural position and needed to build a new life quickly. Whatever the motivation, the marriage lasted until her death. She did not return to the Hearst orbit. The orbit had been designed, from the beginning, to exclude her once the center was removed. Millicent was 69 years old. She had not seen her husband in years. She had not lived with him in 25 years. She had not been loved by him in the way that a wife expects to be loved in more than 3 decades. And yet she was the widow. She was the official mourner. She was the woman whose name appeared in the obituaries, whose sons would inherit the corporation, whose version of the family story, the legal version, the respectable version, the version grounded in marriage and maternity and the stubborn refusal to surrender a title, had prevailed. The strategy she had set in motion in 1926, when she established a separate residence and chose sovereignty over divorce, had been vindicated by the one event that validated all long-term strategies, the passage of time. She had outlasted the romance. She had outlasted the fantasy. She had outlasted the castle, the parties, the Hollywood guests, the $1 million checks, and the private kingdom on the hilltop. She was still Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. She would remain Mrs. William Randolph Hearst until she died. And in the obituaries, in the legal records, in the corporate documents, in the official history of the family name, it was her version. The version of the lawful wife, the mother of the heirs, the New York philanthropist who had spent decades converting injury into public usefulness, that would be entered as the permanent record of what the Hearst family was. The companion of 34 years would become a footnote. The wife of 48 years would be the text. There is no triumph in that victory. There is only structure. Millicent had won the architecture and lost the man decades earlier. Marion had won the man and lost the architecture in a single devastating week. And William Randolph Hearst, who had spent 88 years refusing to choose between his desires, had finally been forced into the one resolution he had spent a lifetime avoiding: an ending. The ending did not reconcile anything. It merely stopped the clock on a contradiction that had been running for 3 decades and left the people inside it to sort through what remained. What remained was an empire, a castle, 5 sons, a generation of grandchildren, 2 women who had each given their best years to the same man, and a name that now had to mean something without the man who had made it mean everything. The dynasty that William Randolph Hearst had built was not destroyed by his death. It was merely forced for the first time to decide what it was, not what he had wanted it to be, but what it actually was when the wanting stopped. That reckoning was not a single event. It would unfold across decades, across generations, across the slow transformation of a personal empire into an institutional one, and across the lives of every person who carried the name he had left behind. The reckoning began immediately and never really stopped. In the weeks after Hearst's death, the family consolidated its hold on the corporation with the efficiency of people who had been preparing for this moment, consciously or not, for decades. The voting trust was neutralized. Marion's claim was relinquished. The board was reorganized around the sons and the professional managers who would guide the company through its transition from personal empire to institutional media conglomerate. Lawyers and accountants began the long process of untangling the estate, the interlocking holdings, the debts, the art that remained in storage, the properties that still bore the Hearst name, the complex web of corporate ownership that William had created and only partially rationalized during the financial crisis of the 30s. The Hearst Corporation would survive. It would more than survive. But it would survive as something fundamentally different from what William Randolph Hearst had built. Not a man's personal instrument, but a family trust governed by committees, managed by professionals, and owned through a structure designed to prevent any single individual from ever again exercising the kind of unchecked personal control that had nearly destroyed it. That transformation was Millicent's legacy as much as anyone's. The structure that survived, the family trust, the sons as stewards, the corporate governance designed for continuity rather than spectacle, was the institutional expression of the principle she had embodied for 25 years, that names endure through structure, not through desire. William had built the empire on appetite. Millicent's line of succession would maintain it through discipline. The corporation that emerged from the post-mortem reorganization was recognizably a Hearst enterprise. It still bore the name, still published newspapers and magazines, still operated in the media landscape William had helped to create. But it was no longer a vehicle for one man's will. It was a family business in the institutional sense, professionally managed, trust governed, and structured so that the dysfunction of the founder could not be replicated by his heirs. The sons who took the reins understood, with the clarity that only damaged children possess, that the worst thing they could do to the company their father had built was to run it the way he had. The 1950s were, for the Hearst Corporation, a decade of recovery and recalibration. The post-war advertising market had strengthened. The newspaper chain, though reduced from its peak, still operated in major American cities. The magazines retained their mass audiences. And the family trust, which now controlled the company's ownership structure, provided the kind of financial stability that William's personal management had never achieved. The sons settled into their roles, George in operations, William Jr. in editorial, the twins rising through the ranks. And the corporation began to function with the quiet efficiency of an enterprise that no longer depended on the daily whims of a single dominating personality. It was not exciting. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of thing that produces headlines or inspires films. It was management. And management, in the aftermath of William Randolph Hearst's decades of mismanagement disguised as genius, was exactly what the company needed. Marion Davies lived another 10 years. She married Horace Brown, a retired naval captain, 11 weeks after Hearst's death, and the marriage endured until her own death on September 22, 1961, in Los Angeles. She was 64 years old. The speed of her remarriage has been discussed endlessly in secondary accounts, and the interpretations range from loneliness to pragmatism to defiance. What seems most likely is the simplest explanation. Marion was a woman who had spent 34 years as the unofficial partner of one of the most powerful men in America. And when that man died and his family closed ranks against her, she understood immediately that her position, socially, financially, emotionally, depended on constructing a new life quickly. She had always been more practical than the mythology allowed. She had invested wisely. She had avoided debt. She had given Hearst $1 million of her own money when his empire was collapsing. She was not a woman who waited for the world to arrange itself around her grief. She acted. The years between Hearst's death and her own were quieter than anything that had preceded them. She lived comfortably on the wealth she had accumulated independently. The real estate, the savings, the investments managed with a shrewdness that Hearst himself had never demonstrated. She did not re-enter the Hearst orbit. She did not attempt to reclaim the position that the voting trust surrender had cost her. She lived privately, out of the headlines, in a manner that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had hosted Charlie Chaplin and Winston Churchill on a California hilltop. Whether those final years were peaceful or diminished, content or merely endured, the record cannot say with confidence. What is clear is that Marion Davies died without the public recognition that her decades of loyalty, companionship, and material generosity to Hearst might have warranted. The cultural memory of her, shaped far more by Orson Welles than by her actual life, would take decades to begin correcting itself. She deserved better from history. She did not get it. The sons moved into the roles that the corporation and the family name required of them, and their trajectories across the 1950s and 60s traced the complicated inheritance of a dynasty that had survived its founders' contradictions, but not escaped them. George Randolph Hearst, the eldest, continued as a vice president of the corporation, the steady, dutiful firstborn, who had spent his adult life inside the system. He died in 1972 at 68, having served the organization for decades without the public visibility of his brother William Jr. or the later notoriety that would attach to his brother Randolph's family. George's life, viewed from the outside, looks like continuity. Viewed from within, it was the life of man who had absorbed the full weight of being the eldest son in a family where the father's choices had made loyalty to both parents simultaneously impossible. He managed the contradiction by managing the company. Work was the space where the divided feelings could be set aside, where competence could substitute for resolution, where being a good executive could stand in for being a whole person. He was buried, like his father, inside the empire he had served. William Randolph Hearst Jr. became, in the years after his father's death, the most publicly distinguished of the brothers. He assumed the role of editor-in-chief of Hearst newspapers and brought to the position a journalistic seriousness that his father, for all his influence, had never fully possessed. William Jr. was not a sensationalist. He was a reporter. His interview with Nikita Khrushchev and his subsequent commentary earned him a Pulitzer Prize, an achievement that belonged to him and not to the family name, even though the name had given him the platform from which to earn it. He would later write about the family with a candor that the other brothers did not attempt, describing the estrangement as a thing that had no formal beginning and no formal end. No formal parting, as the account has it, no announcement, no proceedings. That description, in its quiet precision, captures the Hearst family's relationship with truth. Everything was known, nothing was said, and the silence was maintained so thoroughly that it became indistinguishable from the facts. William Jr. died in 1993 at 85, the last of the brothers to carry both his father's full name and an independent public reputation. John Randolph Hearst, the third son, died on February 13, 1958, at 49. He was the first of the brothers to go, and his early death carried the particular weight of a life that the public record had never fully illuminated. John had worked inside the Hearst Corporation, had raised a family, had navigated the same divided loyalties as his brothers. But his story is the one that the archive holds least tightly, and the outline must acknowledge that absence honestly. Not every thread in a dynasty story resolves with a clear narrative. Some threads simply end, and the brevity of the ending says something that fuller documentation could not. That the cost of growing up inside the Hearst family's managed fracture was not always dramatic, was not always visible, and was not always survivable in the way the word survival usually implies. John Hearst lived 49 years. He was the quiet brother. The record does not say what that quietness contained. David Whitmire Hearst, one of the twins, served as a vice president of the Hearst Corporation and lived a life whose public profile was corporate rather than editorial. He died on May 24, 1986, at 70, of complications related to cancer. Like his twin Randolph, David had extended the dynasty into the next generation, married with children, embedded in the structure that the family trust had been designed to preserve. His contribution was institutional rather than individual. He helped keep the machinery running. In a family that had been defined by the spectacular appetites of its founder, David's steadiness was its own kind of achievement. He did not build castles. He did not collect art on credit. He did not maintain parallel households or sign voting trusts that would plunge the company into crisis. He showed up, did the work, and maintained the silence. That was enough. It had to be. Randolph Apperson Hearst, the other twin, lived the longest of the five brothers and carried the family name the furthest into the late 20th century. He became a major newspaper executive, serving as chairman of the board of the Hearst Corporation, and when Forbes later estimated his personal wealth at $1.8 billion, the figure represented not merely an inheritance, but the accumulated return on a structure that Millicent's endurance and the son's collective management had preserved through decades of potential dissolution. Randolph died on December 18, 2000 at 85. He was the last of Millicent's boys, and his death marked the end of the generation that had lived inside the original fracture. Taken together, the five sons of William and Millicent Hearst represent something more complex than a simple line of succession. They were the generation that absorbed the cost of the dynasty's central contradiction. The generation that grew up inside a family where the public image was power and the private reality was fracture, where love ran in one direction and money ran in another, where the father built castles and the mother built institutions, and where the children were expected to move between both worlds without ever acknowledging that the worlds were incompatible. None of them rebelled, none of them left, none of them spoke publicly about the arrangement until William Jr.'s carefully phrased observations decades later. They did what children of fractured dynasties have always done. They served the system, they maintained the silence, and they passed the inheritance, and both financial and emotional, to the next generation. The inheritance that was not money went with the rest of it. Millicent herself, through all of these years, continued to live the life she had built. The decades between William's death in 1951 and her own in 1974 were not a coda. They were in many ways the fullest expression of the identity she had constructed. She remained in New York. She remained on her committees. She remained at her charities. She continued to be addressed as Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, and the title, far from being an anachronism in the years after her husband's death, became, if anything, more settled, more complete, more definitively hers. There was no longer a competitor for the name. There was no longer a parallel household. There was no longer a castle on a hill presided over by another woman. There was only Millicent, the widow, the mother of the heirs, the philanthropist, the last living link to the marriage that had created the dynasty. She was free, in a sense, for the first time since 1903. But freedom, for a woman whose life had been organized around the management of injury, may not have felt like what the word usually implies. The structure she had built had no exit. It was not designed for happiness. It was designed for endurance. And she endured. She watched her sons assume their positions. She watched her grandchildren grow into the next generation of the family. She watched the corporation transform from her husband's personal instrument into an institutional enterprise managed by professionals. She watched the castle at San Simeon become a public museum. She watched from a distance that was geographical and also emotional, as the world that had once revolved around her husband's desires reorganized itself around structures that no longer required any single personality to sustain them. The empire survived. The family survived. The name survived. Whether Millicent herself thrived, in the interior sense of the word, is a question the public record cannot answer, and the private record, if it exists, has not revealed. But Randolph's name had already become attached to a different chapter of the Hearst story, one that demonstrated with a cruelty no one could have predicted that the family's capacity for public crisis did not end with William's death. On February 4th, 1974, Randolph's 19-year-old daughter, Patricia, was kidnapped from her apartment in Berkeley, California, by a group calling itself the Symbionese Liberation Army. What followed was one of the most bizarre and widely covered episodes in American criminal history. Patricia's captivity, her apparent radicalization, the photograph of her holding a rifle inside a bank during a robbery, the image that would define her in the public imagination for decades, her eventual arrest, trial, and imprisonment. The Patty Hearst case consumed the nation's attention for months and dragged the Hearst name back into the kind of tabloid notoriety that Millicent had spent her life trying to prevent. The irony was savage and multi-layered. The family that had built its fortune on the sensational headlines was now the subject of them. The dynasty that had controlled the machinery of public narrative was now helpless before it. And the grandfather who had used his newspapers to manufacture public reality had produced, 2 generations later, a granddaughter whose reality was being manufactured by forces entirely outside the family's control. Randolph, the father, was photographed looking haggard and desperate during the crisis. A billionaire patriarch reduced to the particular helplessness of a parent whose child has been taken by people who want not money but ideology. The family's wealth, which had insulated it from so many ordinary consequences across so many decades, could not buy Patricia back. It could only make the spectacle larger and the coverage more intense. For the Hearst family, the Patty Hearst crisis was the final proof that the inheritance was not merely money and corporate governance. It was exposure. The name itself was a liability as well as an asset, a magnet for precisely the kind of public drama that Millicent had spent her adult life trying to manage through discipline and silence. The dynasty's original sin, William's belief that he could control narrative itself, that the machinery of publicity could be wielded without consequence, had produced across 3 generations a family that was permanently visible, permanently scrutinized, and permanently vulnerable to the attention its founder had courted. Millicent did not live to see the worst of the Patty Hearst crisis, nor its resolution. She died on December 5th, 1974, in New York, 10 months after the kidnapping. Long enough to know that it had happened, long enough to absorb the knowledge that the family she had held together was once again at the center of a national scandal, but not long enough to see Patricia's arrest, trial, and eventual imprisonment. She was 92 years old. She had outlived her husband by 23 years. She had outlived Marion Davies by 13 years. She had outlived her son John by 16 years. She had spent more than half a century as Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, and she died with the title intact. The title that had been her weapon, her shield, her instrument of public authority, and the only part of the marriage that had survived its dissolution. She was buried with the same quiet determination that had characterized her life since 1926. There was no spectacle. There was no hilltop ceremony. There was no imported marble or medieval tapestry. There was a woman who had entered the Hearst dynasty as the daughter of a vaudevillian and who left it as the matriarch of one of the wealthiest families in America, having secured not through romance or beauty or inherited privilege, but through the disciplined, decades-long performance of public duty, the one thing that mattered most: the continuity of the name. The world that remembered William Randolph Hearst remembered spectacle, appetite, San Simeon, Marion, Citizen Kane, the newspapers, the castles, the art. The world that remembered Millicent, a smaller world, quieter, grounded in New York civic life, and the institutional memory of the charity she had built, remembered something different. It remembered a woman who had been injured and had refused to be defined by the injury, a woman who had been displaced and had built a parallel kingdom on the ruins of the displacement, a woman who had been rendered invisible by the storytelling traditions of her era and had turned that invisibility into a kind of armor. In public life, she remained Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. That single detail contains the entire emotional architecture of her story. The injury, the discipline, the maternal strategy, the refusal to vanish, and the strange fact that in the end the legal wife, not the beloved companion, remained the official container of the name. The cultural afterlife of the Hearst story has been dense and ongoing, but it has belonged almost entirely to William and Marion rather than to Millicent. Citizen Kane remains the dominant fictional image, the film that reduced a life of extraordinary complexity to a single word and a sled, and that in doing so created a mythology more powerful than the history it distorted. The film's influence on how the public understands the Hearst name cannot be overstated. For millions of people who never visited San Simeon, who never read a Hearst newspaper, who know nothing of the 5 Sons or the Free Milk Fund or the 25-year estrangement, Citizen Kane is the Hearst story. And in that story, Millicent does not exist. Later works have attempted to complicate that mythology with varying degrees of success. The battle over Citizen Kane, a documentary first broadcast in 1996, reframed the Wells-Hearst conflict as a collision between 2 outsized American egos and restored some of the historical nuance that the original film had flattened. The Cat's Meow, released in 2001, dramatized the Thomas Ince yacht death folklore that had swirled around Hearst's circle since the 1920s, a story of ambiguous violence aboard Hearst's private yacht that has never been definitively resolved and that added yet another layer of darkness to the family's mythology. Mank, David Fincher's 2020 film about the writing of Citizen Kane, went further in rehabilitating Marion Davies, portraying her with a warmth and intelligence that Wells's original had denied her, and modern commentary on the film has emphasized that the Citizen Kane portrait of the talentless kept woman was unfair to the real person. None of these works center Millicent. They treat the lawful wife as background architecture, present in the chronology, absent from the drama. She is mentioned in passing, referenced as a fact, and then the narrative moves on to the more cinematically compelling figures. Hearst himself, Marion, Wells, the castle, the parties, the scandal. That absence is precisely why a documentary about Millicent feels not merely justified but necessary. The woman who held the dynasty together across 5 decades of managed fracture has been rendered invisible by the very storytelling traditions that her husband helped create. The man who built the machinery of public narrative ensured inadvertently that the woman who survived his narrative would not appear in anyone else's. This documentary is an attempt to correct that omission, not by diminishing Marion or simplifying William, but by placing Millicent at the center of her own story, where she belonged all along. The physical legacy of the dynasty underwent its own transformation, and it is one of the story's most poignant ironies. In 1958, 7 years after Hearst's death, the hilltop complex at San Simeon was donated to the state of California by the Hearst Corporation, and public tours opened the same year. The castle that had been built as a private monument to one man's appetite, the estate that had embodied his desire, hosted his mistress, and humiliated his wife, became a public museum. It was accredited, curated, and open to anyone willing to buy a ticket and make the drive up the coast. Its more than 20,000 objects were cataloged and displayed not as possessions, but as heritage. The rooms where Marion had presided over the most exclusive social gatherings in American life were now toured by families on holiday, by school groups, by tourists who paused before the Neptune pool and tried to imagine what it must have been like to live there. The table where Churchill had sat and observed two charming wives became a museum exhibit with an informational placard. Dynastic privacy became ticketed memory. The wider ranch did not simply disappear. In 2005, the Hearst Corporation and conservation partners finalized a major conservation agreement covering roughly 82,000 acres and 18 miles of Big Sur coastline, and Hearst ranch operations continue on conserved land to this day. The family no longer rules from the hilltop, but the hilltop still teaches the public how to imagine the family that built it. And inevitably, it teaches the version of the story that centers William and Marion, not Millicent. The castle is their monument. The counter kingdom that Millicent built, the charities, the committees, the civic work, the disciplined performance of respectability that sustained the Hearst name through decades of scandal, left no architectural trace. It was never meant to. That was its nature. Structure does not photograph well. Duty does not make a good museum exhibit. But it endures. What remains now is not a ruin, but an operating dynasty in altered form. The Hearst Corporation recorded $13.5 billion in revenue in 2025 and remains one of the largest privately held media companies in the United States. A fact that would have astonished the financial advisors who were selling off William's art collection in the 1930s. The family trust, governed by a 13-trustee structure that disperses authority across the family and prevents any single individual from dominating the enterprise, continues to own the company. The governance is precisely what Millicent's principle of structure over spectacle would have demanded. No patriarch, no personal empire, no unchecked will. A board, a process, a system designed to endure. William Randolph Hearst III, a grandson of William and Millicent, serves as chairman of the board, carrying a name that still sounds like a headline in itself. George Randolph Hearst III, another grandson, remains a director and publisher of the Times-Union in Albany, New York. A working newspaperman, still connected to the medium his grandfather used to build the original fortune. The corporation's portfolio has evolved far beyond the newspapers and magazines that built it. It now encompasses television stations, digital media properties, business information services, and a substantial commercial real estate portfolio alongside its legacy brands, Cosmopolitan, Esquire, Harper's Bazaar, Good Housekeeping, names that trace their lineage directly to the empire William assembled in the early 20th century. The transition from personal empire to institutional conglomerate, which began in the financial crisis of the 30s and accelerated after William's death, is now complete. The Hearst Corporation operates as a 21st century media and business company, managed by professionals, overseen by family trustees, and connected to its founder principally through the name on the building and the trust structure that channels the wealth. The family itself has expanded across generations in the way that American dynasties do. branching, marrying, producing children, some of whom enter the business and some of whom do not, some of whom carry the name publicly and some of whom live at a remove from its burdens and its advantages. The dynasty that began with George Hearst's mining money in the 19th century now extends across multiple branches, multiple cities, and multiple levels of involvement with the corporation that still bears the family name. Some descendants are public figures, others have chosen privacy, a choice that Millicent, who understood better than anyone the cost of a famous name, might have recognized and respected. Patricia Hearst, whose kidnapping in 1974 briefly made the family name synonymous with a different kind of American crisis, was eventually released from prison, received a presidential pardon from Bill Clinton in 2001, and has lived a private life in the decades since. Her story, which for a time threatened to become the defining Hearst narrative for a new generation, has receded into the broader history of the 1970s. The family absorbed that crisis as it had absorbed every crisis before it, through endurance, through institutional continuity, and through the refusal to let any single catastrophe define the name permanently. The name endures. The business endures, the family endures, and the structure that made that endurance possible. The marriage that held in law while it shattered in feeling. The 5 sons who bridged the divide. The trust that channeled the fortune. The corporate governance that replaced the patriarch. Traces its origin to a decision made by a former chorus girl in 1926 when she chose not to divorce the most powerful publisher in America, but to hold the title that his name conferred and use it to build something of her own. Millicent's line held. Her sons inherited the empire. Her grandsons manage it. Her great grandchildren carry the name into a century she could not have imagined. The structure she preserved through a quarter century of managed separation, through the humiliation of San Simeon and the financial crisis of the 30s and the legal shock of the voting trust and the long aftermath of a patriarch's death, that structure proved more durable than the romance, more resilient than the fantasy, and more permanent than the castle on the hill. The chorus girl from a vaudeville family became the matriarch of one of the richest families in America, and she did it not through love or luck or inheritance, but through this disciplined, relentless, half-century long performance of a single, unwavering principle. She would not surrender the name. She would not leave the stage. She would outlast whatever was built to replace her. And she did. There is no neat moral to this story. Millicent Hearst did not defeat scandal by exposing it, and she did not heal humiliation by escaping it. She survived by reorganizing it. William built a world in which he believed wealth could hold contradiction forever. A wife in New York, a companion in California, sons in the middle, a castle on the hill, a press empire large enough to blur the edges of any inconvenient truth. It worked for a very long time, but what lasts in the end is not the fantasy of total possession. It is the colder, stranger endurance of the woman who understood that names and children and public usefulness can outlive romance, and that sometimes dignity is not happiness but structure.